During the course of this presentation, we'll cover periodic engine and chassis maintenance, engine removal, engine overhaul and component reconditioning, and engine assembly. We'll also cover carburetor service, electrical systems operation and troubleshooting, and we'll finish up with fork rebuilding. Begin assembly with the lowercase half. Install the oil pump idler gear, the neutral light switch, and the shift drum. The shift forks are numbered 1, 2, and 3 from left to right. Loctite should be applied to the shift drum bearing retainer screws before installation. Next, install the shift stop arm and the shifter shaft assembly. Set the drum to its neutral position, as shown. After applying assembly lube to the main bearings, install the crank directing the cam chains into their respective tunnels. Now, the positioning of the pistons relative to the rods is critical. The inlet and exhaust valve reliefs must correspond to the inlet and exhaust valves when the pistons are installed. Also, we mentioned earlier that when the rods are installed, the Y marks on the rod bodies and the dots on the rod caps must face away from the adjacent rod. There's a simple method you can use to ensure that the rods and pistons are properly assembled. Place the pistons in order from 1 to 4 with the inlet reliefs facing away from you. Attach the corresponding rod assemblies with the Y marks and the rod cap dots all facing left. Now when you turn the number 2 and number 4 assembly around for installation, the rod marks and the valve reliefs will all be in their proper position. Before installing the piston and the rod assemblies, make sure the ring gaps are staggered. The correct positioning is indicated in the service manual diagram. Lubricate the cylinder walls and install the assemblies, making sure the rod studs don't contact and damage the crank journals. Apply moly-slip grease to the rod stud threads and the nut surface, then torque the rod caps to spec. Install the balancer shaft, aligning the mark on the balancer with the mark on the crankshaft. Correctly timed, the dot on the balancer damper will appear in this window when the number 1 piston is at top dead center. Next, the transmission. Install the transmission main shaft assembly, making sure that both circlips are in place. It's also very important that the bearing stopper pins be properly positioned. The pin on your left must face forward or towards the crank. The pin on your right faces the rear of the engine. The clutch rod seal and bearing are next. The counter shaft assembly with the correct drive pinion gear shim can now be installed. As with the main shaft, the bearing circlip and the stopper pins must be positioned properly. The stopper pin on your left faces the rear of the engine, and the stopper pin on your right faces forward. Lightly tap the shaft to ensure it's positioned properly in the case. Now install the driven pinion shaft so that the arrow on the flange is pointing toward the top of the engine. The proper shims will be installed between the flange and the case after the gear lash is checked. Be sure the gears are set in neutral by turning either shaft and positioning the gears manually. Be sure the dowel pins are installed and apply a light coating of Yamaha 4 to the case. Take care not to get any sealant on the journals or bearing surfaces, and leave about 2 to 3 millimeters clean around the bearing shells. Set the front of the case in position, and while checking that the shift forks engage the proper gears, lower it into place. Now, before going any further, verify that the transmission will shift through all 5 gears. When you're satisfied the transmission is okay, install and torque the case bolts. Again, numbers 1 to 22 are located on the lower case. Numbers 23 to 36 are on the top. The oil gallery pipe bracket is secured by bolt numbers 1 and 3, and the alternator lead wire bracket by number 22. Make sure that numbers 28 and 30 are fitted with appropriate copper washers. The engine ground cable attaches to number 36, and the two shortest 8mm bolts fit the number 25 and 26 positions. And finally, don't forget the trim bracket that attaches to the middle gear case. The transmission main shaft bearing retainer must be installed so that the tab properly engages the oil pump idler gear shaft. And Loctite should be applied before fitting the screws. After the middle drive bearing retainers have been torqued to 2.5 meter kilograms, they must be locked in place. Next, we have to check and correct, if necessary, the lash between the middle drive and driven gear. We do this by first locking the drive firmly in place and then measuring the movement of the driven gear. Once the drive gear holder is secured in place, move the driven gear assembly in or out of the case until you've got 2 millimeters of clearance between the crankcase and the flange. Don't fully tighten the flange bolts. Position your dial gauge so that it contacts the outside edge of the U-joint yoke directly over the center line of the bearing hole. Gently move the shaft back and forth and note the amount of movement on your dial gauge. This measurement must be taken at 4 separate points of rotation. Once you've got your measurement here, unlock the drive gear and rotate the yoke 90 degrees. Relock the drive gear and measure here, then here, and here. Now, to determine the correct shim thickness, you simply move the output shaft assembly in or out of the case until lash is correct. Measure the gap between the flange and the case and fit the proper shim. After the flange bolts have been torqued to spec, in this case 3 meter kilograms, the lash should be rechecked. Before assembling the clutch, install the oil pump idler gear. There is no thrust washer between the clutch basket and the case. There is a washer between the basket and the hub. Install the hub nut using a new lock washer and torque the nut to 7 meter kilograms or 50 foot-pounds. And don't forget the clutch rod and ball. The clutch basket and discs, like those of the XV500, are marked to indicate the proper assembled position of the disc in relation to the basket. The markings themselves are slightly different, but the method of assembly is very similar. One of the disc slots on the basket is identified with 2 cast dots. The friction discs are marked in 2 locations, and there's 2 possible methods of identification. You may find discs that have half-circle cutaways, or ones that are cut square. One tab will be cut with 2 half-circle cutaways, or a large square cut. The tab 180 degrees from that will have 1 single half-circle cut, or a smaller square cut. When fitting these discs, first try the tab with the 2 half-circle cutaways, or if it happens to be the slotted type, the wider slot in the marked clutch basket slot. If it fits and will move freely in the basket, it should be fitted in that position. If it won't fit, or if it binds in the clutch basket, rotate it 180 degrees. When installing the pressure plate, the marks on both it and the hub must align. Installation of the clutch springs, bolts, and cover, and fitting the water pump completes the right side of the engine. The main oil gallery piping, the small oil pipe, the oil pump assembly, and the oil pan can now be installed. Assembly of the left side is limited to the starter gear, key, rotor and rotor bolt, starter gears, shift linkage, and the alternator cover.
The next item on our assembly list is the vent housing. During this assembly, we mentioned that crankcase venting, engine coolant, and engine oil are all routed through this housing in one way or another. So it's very important that the various O-rings be in good condition and that they're positioned carefully during reassembly. Cylinder head installation is next.
After fitting the dowels to the head studs, install the head gasket, making sure you've got the side-marked head facing the head surface. Fit the rear cam chain guide into the hook slot in the case and install the head. The cylinder head nut should be installed dry and torqued in sequence to 4.3 meter kilograms or 31 foot-pounds. After fitting new O-rings, install the water jacket pipe and push the retainer pin into place. Once you've verified that the number 1 or the left rear cylinder is at top dead center, cam timing for the rear bank can begin.
Before we cover cam timing, there's a few things you should know about the camshafts and sprockets. Firstly, cams for both the front and rear banks are identical. The same applies to the exhaust cams. All 4 cams are marked with both a small and a large dot. The small dots are used to index the rear camshafts, and the large dots to index the front. The rear bank cam sprockets are different from those of the front, but each type is common to both the intake and exhaust camshafts for their respective heads.
The rear bank sprockets are marked R for rear, I for inlet, and E for exhaust. The front sprockets are marked F for front, and again I for intake, and E for exhaust. With the number 1 piston at top dead center, the small cam dots align with the index marks on the cam bearings. The cam sprockets are attached to the cams as shown in this diagram. The intake cam sprocket is bolted to the cam using the hole between the I and the R for intake rear. On the exhaust side, you'd use the hole between the R and the E for rear exhaust. With the cam dot somewhere above the horizontal center line of the cam bearings, install and torque the number 1, 3, and 4 exhaust and intake cam caps. On the rear bank, these caps are numbered from right to left as viewed from the rear of the engine. Install the intake sprocket first. Using a 22 millimeter wrench on the hex portion of the cam, bring the small dot in line with the cap index mark. Align the sprocket hole between the I and the R marks with the camshaft, making sure there's no slack in the cam chain between the sprocket and the crank. Then install the bolt. After aligning the small dot on the exhaust cam with the cap mark, position the sprocket so that the bolt hole between the R and the E align with the cam, and again install the sprocket bolt. After installing the chain guide on the intake side, retract the tensioner plunger and bolt the tensioner body in place. Then install the spring and cap. Finally, confirm that the T1 rotor mark and the cam dots are aligned with their respective index marks. Rotate the crankshaft and install the remaining 2 cam sprocket bolts and the I2 and E2 bearing caps.
Front cylinder timing is performed with the number 2 piston at top dead center of its compression stroke. From top dead center for number 1, the crank must be rotated counterclockwise, 360 degrees plus 70 degrees.
The T2 rotor mark should then be in line with the crankcase index. Install the cams, this time making sure the large indexing dots are above the center line of the bearing. The cam bearing caps are again numbered from right to left, but this time as viewed from the front of the engine. Again, leave the I2 and E2 caps off until the sprockets have been installed. Align the larger dots on each cam with the cam cap marks and install the sprockets as shown here. The sprocket bolt for the inlet cam is fitted between the I and F marks, the exhaust between the F and E marks.
Before the cam covers go on, Make sure these oil plugs are securely in place, and you should check tappet clearance. Changing shims now is a lot easier than it will be with the engine in the frame. Except for installation of the upper cylinder oil feed pipe, we're ready to reinstall the engine. If you laid all the pieces out in order when you remove the engine from the frame, you should have no difficulty putting it back together.
As you're positioning the engine into the chassis, make sure the drive yoke engages the shaft properly. You may have to shift the engine slightly to obtain proper alignment.